History is often treated like an unchangeable record of truth. Names, dates, and legendary moments repeated so many times that we stop questioning them. But the reality is, many of the stories we believe about history are not true. Some are exaggerated, some are misunderstood, and some never happened at all. Let's start with one of the most famous myths ever told. Christopher Columbus did not prove that the Earth was round. Long before Columbus was born, ancient Greek scholars had already proven the Earth's shape. Even medieval sailors and scholars accepted it. Columbus's real problem was on convincing people the Earth was round. It was convincing them the journey wouldn't kill him. He underestimated the size of the planet. If the Americas didn't exist, his voyage would have ended in disaster. Columbus didn't defeat ignorance. He got lucky. Another iconic story involves Marie Antoinette and the famous line, "Let them eat cake." This quote has been used for centuries to show how cruel and disconnected royalty was from the poor. But there is no historical evidence she ever said it. The phrase existed decades before she arrived in France. During the French Revolution, it was attached to her name to make the public hate her more. It was propaganda, not truth. Now let's look at ancient Rome. Movies show gladiator fights ending in death every single time. But gladiators were expensive, trained professionals. Killing them meant losing money. Most fights ended with surrender, not death. They had referees, rules, and even doctors waiting nearby. Gladiators were celebrities, not disposable fighters. Archaeologists have never found a single Viking helmet with horns. The idea came from 19th century operas and artwork, not real history. In battle, horns would have been dangerous and useless. People also believe that medieval Europeans never bathed and lived in constant filth. In reality, public bathhouses existed, soap was widely used, and cleanliness mattered. Ironically, people bathed less during later centuries due to fears about disease. And finally, George Washington did not have wooden teeth. His dentures were made from ivory, metal, animal teeth, and even teeth taken from enslaved people. The wooden teeth story became popular because old ivory dentures looked brown and grainy over time. These myths didn't survive because they were true. They survived because they were simple and dramatic. Let's continue. As many of the most famous historical myths are still ahead, and these ones completely change how we see the past. One of the most misunderstood figures in history is Napoleon Bonaparte. He's often remembered as a short man with a massive ego, someone obsessed with conquest because of his height. But in reality, Napoleon was around 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was completely average for a European man of his time. So where did the myth come from? British propaganda. During the Napoleonic Wars, British cartoonists deliberately portrayed Napoleon as tiny and ridiculous to weaken his image. On top of that, confusion between French and British measurement systems made him appear shorter on paper. Over time, political mockery turned into fact, and the myth survived longer than the truth. Now let's move to one of the most romanticized eras ever, the Wild West. Movies show dusty towns filled with constant gunfights, outlaw gangs, and lawless violence. But the real Wild West was far less dramatic. Most frontier towns had strict gun laws. Visitors were often required to surrender their weapons to local law enforcement. Gunfights did happen, but they were extremely rare. Famous shootouts like the OK Corral were exceptions, not everyday life. Most people in the West were farmers, shopkeepers, railroad workers, and families trying to build stable lives. The violent cowboy image was largely created by dime novels and later exaggerated by Hollywood. Another dark myth comes from medieval history torture devices like the Iron Maiden. Museums and textbooks often show these terrifying metal coffins lined with spikes, claiming they were used regularly during the Middle Ages. But historians have found no solid evidence that the Iron Maiden was ever used in medieval times. Most of these devices were invented centuries later, especially during the Victorian era. At that time, people were fascinated with the idea of a savage and cruel past. Inventing extreme torture devices made history seem darker and more dramatic. Medieval justice was harsh, but it wasn't nearly as theatrical as modern myths suggest. Now let's talk about ancient Egypt. For generations, people were taught that slaves built the pyramids under brutal conditions. This idea became popular because it fit a dramatic narrative of oppression. But archaeological evidence tells a very different story. Their graves were discovered near the pyramids themselves, something that would never happen for slaves. These builders were respected specialists, proud of their work. The myths brings us to the next set of myths where romantic stories begin to fall apart even further. Another major myth surrounds medieval knights. Popular culture shows them as noble warriors with strict moral codes, always fighting for honor, justice, and the weak. But reality was far messier. Many knights were mercenaries who fought for whoever paid them the most. They often pillaged villages, abused civilians, and caused widespread destruction. The idea of chivalry mostly existed in romantic poems and stories written long after the medieval period. While some knights tried to follow moral rules, many did not. The shining knight in armor is more fantasy than history. Now, let's address one of the most misunderstood events in American history, the Salem witch trials. Many people believe witches in Salem were burned alive, but this never happened. In Salem, the accused were hanged, crushed with stones, or died in prison. Burning witches was more common in parts of Europe, not colonial America. Salem became a symbol of mass hysteria, but over time, details from European witch trials were mixed into the story, creating a version that never actually occurred. Even modern history isn't safe from myths. One of the most popular stories is that Albert Einstein failed math as a student. This myth is often used to inspire students who struggle in school. But the truth is, the opposite. Einstein was extremely good at math. He mastered advanced mathematical concepts at a young age. The myth started because of confusion over grading systems and mistranslations of his academic records. While the message behind the story is positive, the story itself is completely false. Another myth that almost everyone believes is that the Great Wall of China can be seen from space with the naked eye. This idea existed long before humans ever went to space. When astronauts finally orbited Earth, they confirmed it wasn't true. The wall is long, but it's narrow and blends into the natural landscape. Cities, highways, and airports are far more visible from orbit. Yet the myth continues, because the Great Wall feels so massive that people assume it must be visible from space. There's also the famous saying that history is written by the winners. While catchy, this phrase oversimplifies reality. History is often written by those who had the power to record events, control education, or preserve documents. Many voices were ignored or erased not because they lost, but because they lacked influence. Some historical narratives survived simply because they were repeated, not because they were accurate. And this leads to the biggest myth of all, the idea that history is fixed and complete. In reality, history is constantly being rewritten as new evidence is discovered. Archaeology, technology, and scholarship continue to challenge what we once believed were unquestionable facts. Historical myths survive because they're easy, dramatic, and comforting. Truth is often complicated and uncomfortable. Myths give us heroes and villains. Reality gives us flawed humans making imperfect decisions. So the next time you hear a famous historical story, pause for a moment. Ask yourself who told it, why it was told that way, and what details might be missing. Because sometimes the most unbelievable part of history isn't what really happened, but what we were taught to believe.